This is College Matters from the Chronicle.
College is seen much more as an investment, and parents are looking for their students to get that return. Because the financial investment is so enormous, parents want to make sure that their students don't put a foot out of place.
Helicopter parents, snowplow parents, curling parents. For decades now, snarky journalists have been dreaming up new terms to describe overprotective moms and dads, the sort who monitor their children obsessively and attempt to clear every obstacle from their lives. With new technologies like GPS tracking, parents have even more ways to stay present in their children's lives, no matter how far from home they travel to pursue an education. For journalists, all of this is catnip. In the past year or so, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, New York Magazine, and USA Today, among others, have all published some version of their obsessive parent story. Maybe you read the one about the $10,000 custom dorm room design. After hearing these stories, it would be easy to conclude that Gen X parents are smothering their Gen Z children. And maybe they are. But what's the right balance? When it comes to parenting a college student, how much is too much? To dig into all of this, I spoke recently with Lisa Heffernan, co-founder of Grown and Flown, an online resource center for parents of young adults. Grown and Flown's popular Facebook group has 1 million followers, a lot of whom seem to be wrestling with varied success about how to support their children without overdoing it. Lisa is a writer and co-author, along with Mary Dell Harrington, of Grown and Flown, How to Support Your Teen, Stay Close as a Family, and Raise Independent Adults. Lisa, thank you so much for coming on College Matters.
Thank you so much for having me.
So we hear a lot about intrusive parenting, but how pervasive do you think this problem really is?
Well, these stories make for great copy. They allow parents to be aghast at the behavior of other parents. They allow us all to feel a little bit better about our own parenting. And parenting is a really, really tough job, so something that makes you feel better about it is certainly welcome. But one of the things that all of these articles are long on, and you and I have both read some of them, I'm sure listeners have read many of them as well, they are very, very long on anecdote, and they are very, very short on data. They rarely show how prevalent the behavior is. There's lots of outlandish stories, lots of anecdotes, but hopefully today we'll get into some of that data and we'll get to look at exactly how prevalent there are. Nothing in these articles is untrue. The things that are described there are absolutely happening. But the important thing we need to talk about, I think, today is how prevalent that is, the impact it has, and why parents are doing some of these things.
I want to talk about that. There's also a suggestion, I think, in some of these articles that this is getting worse. And I wonder, that's sort of separate from whether it's pervasive. Do you have a view on that?
I think what's happening is we are going through a huge period of adjustment where we have technologies and we have changing relationships. We have a change in global economy. The cost of college has changed radically since many Gen X parents were there themselves. So we're having a period of adjustment where people don't know exactly what to do. So you can track your kid and you can track every movement they make. Maybe there's some reasons to do that if they're on a long drive. Maybe let's say they're doing a 12-hour drive back from college. Tracking them may not be a bad idea. Some of these technologies allow you to see if there's an accident or some sort of problem with the car. That might not be a bad idea. Tracking them every Saturday night, perhaps a bad idea. So we're just learning how to use some of these things because they're so new to us.
Do you recall any particular horror stories from your own observations?
Yes, there are. So my very large Facebook group is full of parents who sometimes unwittingly acknowledge things that they have done, including things like parents moving into their kids' dorm rooms and trying to hold a bed for the child. Say the child,
wow.
Sometimes the universities have a sort of before class begins, the kids go away on these trips or they do a service project or something. And parents have moved into the dorm rooms to try and hold what they consider the better bed in the room. These stories that we see about decorating and the amounts of money, I think you and I are going to touch on that. Some of those are both outlandish and completely true. And send a really, really bad message to the students and to other students about what a dorm might need to look like.
So why do you think some parents get this balance wrong? What's really at play here?
I think it's because we're just learning. We can't harken back to our own childhoods. We don't have any guideposts. We don't know what to do. And I also think some of these follies that we're talking about are the follies and the behavior of the wealthy or the super wealthy. And the rest of us just love to look on. Mm-hmm. Those kinds of stories are inaccessible to many people, to most people, but they make for great entertainment.
I'm so glad you raised that because I think that there was a lot of conversation around this, around the Varsity Blues admission scandal, where you had parents that were going to great lengths to get their kids into what they perceive to be a top college. We all know this story. I think it was made into a Netflix movie. The other thing is we're really talking about students in these stories tend to be middle class, upper middle class. It seems to me when I'm reading these, they're going to residential colleges. These are not, the vast numbers of commuter students that are going to community colleges. It's a very specific slice of life that's being written about here. So I'm glad you raised that.
Well, let's look at the dorm situation because that one gets a lot of social media play because the images are so terrific. Mm-hmm. The images of GPS tracking your kid aren't so incredible, but these dorm rooms make for great entertainment value, and they do really well on the likes of TikTok and Instagram. So one of the stories that's made a lot of news was from U.S. News, and it talked about the average student spending, I think it was about $10,000. Do I have that right?
Yeah, I think the article you're talking about was in the New York Times. It's about a design company that charges $10,000 to make over a dorm room.
Exactly. So if you scratch below the surface for just a moment, and again, let's use data to counter Anecdote. The National Retail Federation looks very closely at what parents spend because it's very much in their interest that parents spend a lot of money on dorm items. And what they found last year in the last school year is that the average family spent $192 on dorm furnishings for their student. They spent more than that to send their kids off because there was a budget for technology and there was a budget for clothing and other necessities that a student might have. But they spent $192 on their students' dorm furnishings. Well, $192 is a far cry from $10,000, and that $192 probably included things like sheets and towels and blankets and other things they needed and a few things to make the place feel like home. But $192 does not make a great story. It just isn't a great headline. And as we know, and people in higher education know better than I do, college is at the brink of affordability and over the brink of affordability for most parents. So the notion that people would spend that kind of money when they are struggling for tuition really strains belief.
So you are data-driven, and I love it. When you and I have talked before, you talk about research and how it informs your work and your views on all of this. I wonder what the research tells us about parent-child relationships and how they've changed over time. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, there's a lot of data on this. Again, it's not making the headlines at all. One of the things that we have found, current college students are much closer to their parents than those parents were to their parents. And they're much more likely to discuss the important things in their life with their parents and to go to their parents for advice. And this is where I think we conflate not being an adult with going to your parents for advice. So 30 years ago, if you didn't know how to get an internship or you were confused about maybe your romantic relationships, you might talk to somebody your own age. You might talk to your friends. You would be far less likely to talk to your parents. So you, the 19-year-old who was struggling to figure out how to put your resume together, would ask another 19-year-old who knew no more than you do. This generation is far more likely to go to their parents for those sources of information. Again, let's go to the data for a second. Only 45% of current parents say that they would have talked to their parents about advice about finance or work. Now that number is almost 70%. So that's a really big shift from 45% to 70%. Things like financial situations, work situations, personal situations does not mean that these young people are not becoming adults. It just means they're using their parents for advice more than they're using their peers as they would have in a previous time.
The data you're describing come from Pew Research Center, and we'll link to that in our show notes. I'd like to drill more deeply, though, into what we know about the relationships today between parents and their young adult children. There's a perception that parents are forcing themselves upon their kids, but what do the data tell us?
Absolutely. Parents talk to their kids a lot more. Of course, now we have the technology. I think many people listening may remember if they went to college, they may have talked to their parents once a week on the telephone, maybe at a prearranged time. I certainly remember my dorm roommates and I all had prearranged times that we talked to our parents. And I will tell you the truth that my parents spent part of that phone call every week talking about how expensive that phone call was. So we were all limited in the communication that we could have had with our parents. There was really one means, well, I guess you could write letters, but there was really one means of communication. That was the telephone, and the telephone had an expense involved with it. Obviously, now parents can talk to their students in unlimited ways. So About 61% of students say that they text their parents, and texting is the most common form of communication, at least a few times a week. And parents say that they are very happy with that level of communication, and students are very happy with that level of communication. Not only that, in the Pew Research, we found that the communication level, 66% of students said that the communication level is what they want. Another 27% said they would like to communicate more with their parents. And it was only 7% who said they thought the communication was too much.
It does belie this notion that parents are chasing after their kids and the kids are really upset about it. I've certainly seen that story reported too. I guess the corollary to that, if I'm to be hypercynical about it, is that young people want a lot of things that aren't good for them. They want TikTok and they do keg stands, right? So is it possible that they want a relationship and a closeness that maybe in the long run is stifling their independence that isn't great for them?
I think that would be the case if we saw them not actually being able to become adults. I think we need to look at the fact that adulthood has changed, that the milestones are all coming later, it's all coming slower, and that it's a different world. We hearken back to this as if there was some nirvana in the 1990s or 1980s, and that was the only way to be, and the way we're doing it now is wrong. If we look at it differently and say some fundamental things have changed, including an economic situation makes it much harder for students and graduates to become economically independent as quickly as students and graduates did in previous generations, then maybe what's going on right now is not wrong. This is not to say for a moment that there aren't some group of parents that are over-communicating and stifling their young people's independence. But I just don't think it's in the numbers and in the quantities and the severities that we read about in these breathless stories.
Yeah. Now, before we spoke, you were kind enough to put a poll on your Facebook page for us, and we asked parents whether they'd done any of the following things for their college-age children, things like studying for a test, asking a professor for a grade change. I was curious about that. Reminding them to wake up on time. What did we learn from that?
Well, luckily we learned that only 1% asked professors for a grade change, because that would have been pretty horrifying. We learned that parents are involved in their students' lives, in their college lives. And we learned a couple of things. The things that they were doing most commonly were helping them edit or proofread a paper, helping them select classes, giving them advice, financial advice, helping them brainstorm things. And the most common by an absolute mile was setting up appointments, doctor's appointments, dentist appointments.
You need to get to the dentist, son.
Exactly.
Right?
That one kind of threw me. I didn't really expect that. I have understood that this generation doesn't love to pick up a telephone and doesn't like to use their telephones for making phone calls. 30%, almost 30% of the parents were making appointments for their young people. I also delved into the comments, and I thought some of those were interesting. One of the parents said, "I have helped my kids in selecting classes and proofreading essays for them. I'm almost 50, and I still have my mom proofread my work." Thought that was an interesting twist.
Yeah.
One said, "They like to bounce ideas off me. Sometimes they vent about classes or situation. I try not to offer advice unless I'm asked." So there's a lot of being the outlet for your student, being the person that they can sort of talk out loud to. And if that's the function that parents are serving, that's perhaps excellent.
And we should say this isn't a scientific survey we did.
No.
I think there were about 3,800 respondents.
Yes.
But I think about 29% of them said they had helped schedule an appointment for a son or daughter, which I did find interesting too. Do you see any issue with that, or does that feel in line with what a parent of a emerging adult, as they're sometimes called, should do and might do?
I don't know that one's neither here nor there. I mean, it's obviously something you need to learn how to do as yourself, as an adult. A number of parents made comments like their students had chronic illnesses of some sort, and they were still helping their young people monitor their health care. I think some of it is because they don't like to make these phone calls. I think some of it is because it's things like dentists and who wants to go to the dentist. It's not a particularly onerous thing that parents are doing, I think, for students. This one doesn't concern me the same way it would have concerned me if we'd seen big numbers about waking them up or talking to their professors for them.
Yeah, this idea I have in my head of, a wealthy parent picking up the phone and calling the professor and say, "Why did my son get a C instead of a B?" Maybe I'm starting to think that's a little bit of a Hollywood cliche. I'm sure we'll hear from professors if I'm wrong, but I have looked at conversations on X, for example, about this, and a lot of the professors that are responding to that claim are saying, I've been doing this for 30 years. I've heard from one parent, and it was a very innocuous exchange. Again, if that's happening more pervasively, get back to us, people who are listening to this. But that's not something I've heard, and that's consistent with what you heard as well.
There are some parents who do it. And I think this is a situation where it's something that never happened before, and now a small group of parents are doing it. So it's notable that something that didn't exist now exists, and that startles people. Parents who are thinking these things through are the parents who recognize they have enough self-awareness to recognize that there is a line and it can be crossed, and we all cross it sometimes, but the goal is to do it as infrequently as possible. It is very easy when your college junior is struggling to find an internship to just get on the phone and start barking out orders. This is what you need to do. This is the resume. This is LinkedIn. Here's where you need to talk to, and try and take control of the process. And you're doing it for the best will in the world. You want your student to have that internship. You want your student to have those financial opportunities available later. If you're worried about doing that, you're ahead of the game. It means that you recognize that there is a line that you're about to cross where you are encroaching on their independence, and they need to come to some of these solutions themselves.
There's a interesting phenomenon that takes place on message boards and Facebook groups like yours, which is the parent who is about to do something. They are perhaps about to cross the line, and they may describe how they're going to do that. What do you think's really happening there when a parent does that?
I think they're asking to be talked off the ledge. We see this all the time. Parents are about to do something super outlandish. They're about to call the roommate. They're about to call the roommate's parents because they don't like something that's happening in the dorm room. Their freshman is in an uncomfortable situation, living with a person they don't know, and they are about to take charge of that situation by calling that young person and weighing in. And they'll come into the Facebook group and they'll say, do you think I should do this? And they are asking that question because they want, in our case, hundreds and hundreds of parents to say, step away from your phone now. Step away. So yes, there's very much a phenomenon, and those parents have a level, most of the time, have a level of self-awareness that they're trying to stop themselves.
Stick around. We'll be back in a minute.
If you're enjoying the show, do us a favor and subscribe on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Also, leave a review or invite a friend to listen. You can find our show notes and sign up for our newsletter at chronicle.com/College Matters. Thanks for listening.
We've had a conversation on this show before about what you might call the transactional nature of college today. Students and their families are making a big investment in higher education, and they're expecting a lot in return. They expect support, they expect services, they may even expect better grades from their professors. Do you think some of the behavior we're seeing from parents today reflects a consumer mindset?
I do. I very much think it does. I don't need to tell anybody who's listening to hear that, college has become something that's an enormous financial stressor on families when it once wasn't. The Gen X parents who we're talking about today may have gone to colleges where it was not a financial strain on their parents, and their summer earnings and their part-time jobs helped them pay for college. And students were shouldering some of that burden. Now that parents are shouldering a very large part of that burden, and it is an enormous stressor on most rather than many families, I think parents feel that they need to get that return for the investment that they're making.
The expectation may have changed that the college is going to be more responsive to my needs, however small or picky.
But also that the financial outcome for their student, if something doesn't go right, so if a student were to fail a class and have to repeat it, and that means going into a ninth semester, the financial impact of that is so onerous that it needs to be avoided and something needs to be done, as opposed to an earlier time where I went to a large public university that was extremely inexpensive. If I'd had to go an extra semester, it would not have been a stress. I probably could have earned the money for another semester myself with part-time jobs and summer jobs. So that just would have been a different outcome in a family than it is now if something like that were to occur, and that's probably triggering some of the parental involvement.
Let's talk about a different kind of parental involvement that I had not heard of until recently. It's a concierge mom. What is a concierge mom?
Concierge mom is somebody that you pay who lives in the local area. So if your student isn't in an easy to access drive from your home, you pay a mom in, and say you live in Atlanta and your kid's in school in Chicago, you pay a mom in the Chicago area who's part of an organization, either on a year-long basis or monthly basis, to do things that you might have done but can't do because you're not there.
Examples, if you can think of them.
Examples would be to show up with brownies at a birthday, to have a little celebration, or to run to the drugstore for them and grab cough syrup and, headache remedies when they get sick, that sort of thing.
I'm seeing some moms thinking this is a great idea. I'm seeing some listeners saying, oh my God, are you serious?
Exactly.
Where do you come down on this?
Well, I come down on it that it's probably unnecessary in a lot of cases because
Unnecessary?
we have all these delivery services. So if your kid really is sick and it's really, really cold outside, they can just get these things delivered to them.
I don't know what your relationship's like with your DoorDash driver, but I wouldn't call him a mom.
No.
Maybe this is...
No, but he will bring you cough syrup when you've got a cold. So some of these things we can very easily do ourselves.
And it's, again, it sounds like a hyper-privileged example, too. I mean, the number of families that could contemplate paying for such a thing seem infinitesimally small to me.
The one that I think that's super important is the tracking one, because that's available to a lot of families.
Talk to me about that. Yeah.
Either in the Find My Phone app, but there's an app called Life 360, which is very popular. This is a conversation that comes up among parents in our Facebook group regularly, and I would say weekly or almost daily, whether or not to track your student. Parents have often done this in high school. The argument is often safety. We have brand new drivers. Some of these apps will tell you how fast your teenager is driving.
Oh, wow.
Frankly, that would have been a really nice thing to have when my kids were teenagers.
I don't know if you would have slept a lot if you had that information.
I think it's worth knowing because you are trying to teach them to drive. And as we all know, teenagers are not the safest drivers. Super important. There are functions that these apps serve. A number of parents, when I brought this up in the group, talked about how their kids do have a chronic illness. They have type 1 diabetes or something. And it's super important that they know that their kid is up and going in the morning and that everything's okay and that they're watching for their health. I think, again, like we've talked about earlier, it's super important to delve into the numbers. One of the things that the Pew data showed us that it was only 1 in 4 parents, so 25% of parents, were tracking their young adult students or their young adult children using one of these location apps. And when you dig a little further into those numbers, only 7% were rarely tracking. So they were using this on a very occasional basis, maybe the kind of situation we were talking about earlier when the student might be making a very long drive. 12% said they sometimes tracked, but it was 6% who often tracked their students. More often female students than male students, and they said the overwhelming issue was safety. So the notion that all parents are tracking all their students all the time, which you could infer from some of these headlines, isn't true, but 6% of parents were very often tracking their students, which very much might be a problem.
That's really interesting because I can see both arguments here. Parents, want to know if somebody's off the grid, I guess, but at the same time, you can totally see how this would be invasive and invite a lot of questions.
They're doing things like tracking their students leaving the library at night and going back to their dorm. They want to make sure that their student got there safely. Uh-huh. But it's just a tiny hop from tracking your student going to the dorm than tracking your students to the parties they're going to and whose dorm rooms they're going to and the sorts of things that students need to be able to do with privacy.
Right. And I could see that being unhealthy for the parent, too, in addition to the child. But I think we should talk about mental health as part of this picture. Over the past decade, we know students have been coming to college with higher rates of anxiety and depression. Those numbers dipped a bit recently in a national survey, but they remain a big source of concern for college leaders. How much do you think student mental health needs are driving parental involvement? Are parents just more worried and for good reason?
I think it's driving a lot of their behavior because when your student first goes to college, they're not surrounded by family and friends who know them. They're surrounded by people who won't actually realize that something is wrong, if something is wrong, because they barely know them. Their roommate may have met them days and weeks ago. Is their roommate going to understand when something really isn't right? Maybe, but maybe not. Some of those signals and signs we get from people, it's because we know them and we know that the way that they're behaving now is not themselves. So I think parents are trying to keep a little bit closer to their students when they're worried about mental health problems. Maybe they've seen something like this in high school, or maybe they had reasons to be cause of concern over the summer. And I think that is driving, particularly among freshmen, it's driving this closer communication.
I think this mental health conversation also connects to how young people feel about making it in the world on their own, period. Affording a home seems out of reach. A lot of jobs today feel like they could be maybe done by AI pretty soon, if not already. There's a lot of political turmoil in the country and concerns about climate change. Are these things affecting how much parents feel like their children need them?
I think they are. I think that parents, one of the things we saw in the survey that you and I looked at earlier is parents being involved in the selection of classes among their students, talking over what classes the students are going to take and what major perhaps a student might endeavor to. And I think that harkens back to something you mentioned earlier, that college is seen much more as an investment, and parents are looking for their students to get that return. Because the financial investment is so enormous, parents want to make sure that their students don't put a foot out of place, that everything that they're doing will lead to whatever their final goal is. So I think they are very concerned about that.
Yeah, and if they're walking into a more challenging job market, if they're walking into a period of great uncertainty in the country or the world, all the more reason to get it right in college in terms of what you decide you're going to do, what your qualifications are going to be. That makes a lot of sense to me. Where do you think this is all headed? Should we be worried that a generation of young people are going to be lost without their parents' help? I think that's the extreme concern here, and we've sort of talked around it.
I don't think we need to be worried. I think where we're headed is we'll figure out how to use these things. So the tracking technologies, or the fact that we can endlessly text our kids, and we have the communication available to them 24/7, even though we all know it's not healthy to communicate with our young adult students 24/7. So I think a couple of things. We're going to get used to the technology. A generation of parents will arrive soon who have had that technology themselves as teenagers, and they will be more comfortable with it, and they will know how to use it better because it will have been a feature in their lives. So some of this is literally just growing pains as we figure out how to make this adjustment. I think what we're looking at is a fundamental shift of families being closer for longer, and I think we should celebrate that. Parents' closeness with their young adults is lasting, as the Pew Research showed us, and AARP did similar research. Parents are remaining close to their young adults into their 20s and 30s in a way that almost harkens back to America in an earlier period, where you weren't expected to just go off to college and then move to another city that didn't have any contact with your parents, that you would have, as a young adult, probably lived with your parents. As a young married, you might have lived with your parents, that you would have stayed in closer contact with them. Now, we may not be staying in that physical contact, but now we're staying into that electronic contact. So I think we are going to learn how to use it because we're going to have a generation more comfortable with the technology. This closeness is absolutely to be celebrated as a positive thing rather than a negative thing. And the economy, I really can't predict that any better than anyone else.
Yeah. You've hit on something interesting about that generational change, because I do think I'm in my 40s and, well, late 40s now, let's be honest. And I do think that there was a celebration and expectation around Gen X adults not only going to college in a remote area, but maybe moving to a faraway city that felt more cosmopolitan and full of opportunity, and all the better if it was a place at great distance, because that meant they had really made it. And I wonder if you're describing a changing cultural norm around that.
I think that that's what we're seeing. I mean, it was expected that you went off to college and you probably never lived with your parents again. For most kids, that is not economically possible now. So we can just take that off the table. That has nothing to do with growing up or not growing up or separating or not separating. It has to do with the price of housing. So many students need to come back and live with their parents and save some money in their first job by living with their parents. But second of all, it's a really interesting reflection, and it's somewhat anecdotal, but I do have hundreds of thousands of parents that I can seek these anecdotes from. Many, many young adults went back and lived with their parents during the COVID period, during the lockdown period. And many young people and parents described that as an extremely happy time. Not happy that people were sick, not happy that we were all afraid about illness, not happy about the tragedy unfolding in our lives, but happy about the closeness that allowed families. There's nothing magical about separating from your family and being completely independent. A lot of psychologists say what we're really striving for is interdependence, not independence. We're striving for a closeness with our family where we help our kids help us. One of the interesting things also in the Pew survey was how many young people said they were emotionally supporting their parents, that it ran both ways. But isn't that what families are there for? Our families there to support each other in all the ways we have needs.
You know, as I hear you talking, I go back to some of the things you said earlier about some of this outlier behavior. And it is interesting, and I do think it does reflect some cultural realities. I think it reflects an obsession with image and TikTok and, wanting to put the pictures out there and look at my daughter's dorm room. I think that's real, and I think people are right to question whether it's problematic. But I do think, just in my own conversations and observations, that a lot of parents are really trying to get this right. And what we're seeing in a lot of cases are parents who are scared to death about the welfare of their children, which is a tale as old as time. And I wonder if you could give a piece of advice to a terrified parent of a college student today, what would it be?
I think there's a little rule of thumb that you can use, and I think it's super helpful. I didn't dream it up myself, so you're going to just have to accept it as not original, but I think useful. When you're trying to decide whether something is over-parenting, you can't harken back to your own adolescence. That isn't going to help you. The world is different. Don't go back in your head to 1992. That place isn't going to be useful. Ask yourself if the thing that you're about to do, would you do for someone else's child? Would you do it for a niece or a nephew or a close friend's son or daughter? If your student is asking you, Mom, will you proofread my resume? Mom, would you just look at this paper and just say, you're an outside reader. Does this make sense? I would do that for my niece. I would do that for a friend's child. That's not overparenting. That's not smothering. That's not keeping someone from becoming an adult. If you use that rule of thumb, it helps you from doing those things that are too much, because you wouldn't do those things that are too much for someone else. Our inclination is to do them for our own kids because of our emotional involvement, but you can always use that as a yardstick in your head.
Are there things parents can do in your mind that do facilitate greater independence for their children?
I think there are. One of the things that students are asking their parents a lot about is money. And I think we haven't done enough to teach our kids about how to use money, how to budget money, how to save money, how to think about money, how to invest money until they're actually there. So that's a process that I think parents can start much earlier on and will help students remain independent. Financial independence is something obviously to be sought, but I don't know that we do enough teaching around it early enough. And what we hear all the time are parents saying, my kid doesn't have any idea what to do with money and they're making a mess of it. So starting that much earlier facilitates independence. The other thing, and one of the comments I thought that we just touched on, was the mother said, I listen. I just listen. Because a lot of times what kids want to do is think out loud. And if you're just the person at the end of the phone, and if you just remind yourself, don't talk, don't talk, don't talk, just acknowledge that you've heard that. Your young person will work some of these things out on their own. And if you can do that, Lisa D'Amour, who's a well-known psychologist and expert on adolescence, calls it taking out the emotional trash. They call us and they dump some emotional problem on us or some logistical problem on us. And the very act of doing that is the solution. That's all they needed. They needed to think out loud. They needed to get it off their chest. And now they can go on with what they're doing. So I think the advice to parents is try not to talk. Try to listen.
Well, Lisa, I've learned a lot. Thank you for talking with me about this and adding some context. I've really enjoyed it.
Thank you. It's been terrific being here.
College Matters from the Chronicle is a production of the Chronicle of Higher Education, the nation's leading independent newsroom covering colleges. If you like the show, please leave us a review or invite a friend to listen. And remember to subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts so that you never miss an episode. You can find an archive of every episode, all of our show notes, and much more at chronicle.com/College Matters. If you like, drop us a note at collegematters@chronicle.com. We are produced by Rococo Punch. Our podcast artwork is by Cottrell Thomas. Special thanks to our colleagues Brock Reed, Sarah Brown, Fernanda Zamudio Suarez, Laura Krantz, Carmen Mendoza, Ron Coddington, Joshua Hatch, and all of the people at the Chronicle who make this show possible. I'm Jack Stripling. Thanks for listening.